For over 3 decades, the world moved in one direction, toward more connection, more cooperation, more trade. Borders blurred. Shipping lanes became arteries. A factory in Malaysia built parts for a device designed in California, sold in Europe, and serviced in India. This wasn't just economics. It was an ideology, one that said the future was global, the future was shared. That ideology was called globalization. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to the birth of the internet, globalization was the dominant force shaping the modern world. It lifted billions out of poverty, made products cheaper, and linked people, governments, and businesses in ways never imagined. But in 2025, the question is no longer how far globalization can go. The question is, has it already begun to fall apart? The signs were there. They started as whispers, grumblings in towns left behind by manufacturing jobs, quiet outrage over unfair trade deals, the discomfort of cultural homogenization, and the fear that identity was being lost to a system that valued efficiency more than humanity. Then came the shocks. On COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US-China trade war, its supply chain collapses, energy price crises, food shortages, rising nationalism, and now, in 2025, the clearest signal of all. The return of tariffs, the resurgence of walls, the language of economic war. We're living through a moment that economists, historians, and leaders may one day call the turning point. A time when globalization stopped growing and began shrinking, and the world turned inward. Let's rewind. The 1990s were a golden age for the global economy. The Cold War had ended, capitalism had triumphed, and the internet was just beginning to knit the planet together at unprecedented speed. Supply chains spread across continents. Factories relocated to wherever labor was cheapest. The World Trade Organization was formed. New trade deals connected North America, Europe, Asia, and beyond. Companies became global. Cities became international. Borders felt like relics of a slower, older time. This was the end of history that thinkers like Francis Fukuyama predicted. A peaceful world driven by trade and technology, where every country would eventually become democratic, open, and integrated. And for a while, it worked. From 1990 to 2010, global trade soared. China's rise reshaped the global economy. America's corporations became more powerful than many nations. Europe opened its borders, and the term emerging markets became synonymous with hope. There were winners everywhere. Consumers enjoyed cheaper goods. Investors reaped massive profits. Developing countries saw growth that once seemed impossible. But underneath the surface, cracks were forming. Because while globalization created wealth, it didn't distribute it evenly. In wealthy countries, the working class felt betrayed. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. Wages stagnated, and entire regions, especially in the American Midwest and the UK's North, were hollowed out. In developing nations, industrial growth often came with environmental destruction, corruption, and exploitation. And across the globe, people began to ask, who is globalization really for? The backlash began. First in politics, with leaders who promised to take back control, close the borders, protect the worker, put the nation first. Then in policy, with tariffs, immigration restrictions, domestic subsidies, and threats to pull out of international treaties. The most symbolic moment came in 2016, when the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. But it wasn't the only one. In the US, Donald Trump was elected president on an anti-globalization platform. His trade war with China became one of the defining policies of his first term. And in 2025, back in power again, he made his boldest move yet, a 145% tariff on Chinese imports. It was the clearest message yet. The era of global free trade was ending, and a new era of strategic decoupling, economic nationalism, and regional alliances was beginning. This wasn't just politics, it was a restructuring of how the world works. And then came the wake-up calls. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how fragile the global system truly was. Hospitals in the West ran out of masks made in Asia. Supermarkets ran out of food. Factories shut down because one missing part from one country stalled entire production lines. For decades, the system had been optimized for cost and speed, but not for resilience. And resilience, as it turned out, was the one thing it lacked. The post-pandemic world began to rethink everything. Countries started building domestic stockpiles. Governments invested in local production. Companies shortened their supply chains. The conversation shifted from, how cheap can we make this, to what happens if we can't get it at all? Globalization, once seen as a strength, was now viewed by many as a liability. The fall of globalization didn't happen all at once. It's not a war or a revolution. It's a quiet unraveling, a thread pulling loose from a sweater woven over decades. And as the threads come apart, we're beginning to see the true cost of a world built on fragile interdependence. The world is changing, the rules are being rewritten, and globalization, as we knew it, may never return. The death of the supply chain. Why the world stopped trusting itself. It was once considered a modern miracle, the global supply chain, a vast invisible web that wrapped around the planet, connecting raw materials to factories, factories to ships, ships to stores, and stores to homes. You could tap a button on your phone in New York, and a product assembled in Shenzhen, packaged in Thailand, and flown out of Singapore would arrive on your doorstep in just 2 days. The system was efficient, it was fast, and it was beautiful, as long as everything worked. But in 2025, it no longer does. The global supply chain has broken. Not all at once, not with a bang, but in hundreds of small, painful stutters, like a machine coughing to death. And now, the same system that powered globalization is revealing its greatest weakness. It was never built for disruption. At the heart of globalization was one driving idea: efficiency. Companies raced to cut costs, outsource labor, and source materials from wherever they were cheapest. Regardless of distance or political risk, factories moved to Asia. Food came from Latin America. Microchips were made in Taiwan. Medical supplies from India. Rare earths from China. It worked, until it didn't. The first crack was COVID. Suddenly, the world's most optimized systems fell apart. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of masks. Tech companies delayed launches. Cargo sat for weeks, unmoved and unopened. And beneath the chaos, a question was whispered in boardrooms and governments. What if we've made everything too fragile? After the pandemic, companies promised resilience. Words like diversification, localization, and redundancy became popular. But building resilience isn't cheap, and many corporations, once the fear faded, simply went back to the old model: lean, fast, dependent. So when the next shocks came, war in Ukraine, trade wars, and Trump's 2025 tariffs, they were caught off guard again. The 125% tariff on Chinese imports wasn't just an economic measure. It was a supply chain killer. Thousands of American companies, from electronics manufacturers to clothing brands, found themselves instantly priced out of their own products. And consumers? They started asking why. Why does one country shutting its ports mean my phone gets delayed by 6 weeks? Why does a war 5,000 miles away affect the price of pasta? Why is my medicine made overseas? For the first time, globalization wasn't just a political debate. It was personal. It wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about trust. And in 2025, the world stopped trusting the system it had built. Governments responded, not with words, but with action. The US announced subsidies for domestic manufacturing. India banned exports of certain medical products to ensure local access. The EU launched the Strategic Autonomy Plan, aiming to bring home production of critical goods. China pushed its dual circulation strategy, a plan to reduce reliance on Western demand. And everywhere, a quiet movement began. Build at home. Store more. Trade less. The age of just-in-time was being replaced by the age of just-in-case. And with that shift came a new kind of global map. A map not of openness and speed, but of fragmentation. Countries began forming new trade relationships, not because of profit, but because of political alignment. The US courted India, Vietnam, and Mexico as alternatives to China. China deepened ties with Russia, Iran, Brazil, and parts of Africa. Europe drifted into its own orbit, wary of both superpowers, leaning toward green technology and regional resilience. The world was no longer one system. It was many competing ones. And with every broken supply line, every trade dispute, every tariff, those systems drifted further apart. Globalization had promised that we were all connected, that no nation could thrive alone. that the world together was stronger than its parts. But now, that promise feels fragile, and the connections feel more like chains. Chains that leaders want to break. In just a few years, the world went from trusting its supply chain like clockwork to fearing it like a trap. And the fallout is only beginning. Because when trust breaks, in trade, in systems, in each other, the consequences go far beyond missing shipments and price hikes. They shape how nations act, how economies function, and how wars begin. The rise of many worlds, trade blocs, power shifts, and a fractured future. In the old world, there was one global economy. It didn't matter where something was made or who made it. As long as it was cheap, fast, and functional, it had a place in the machine. Nations competed, but they also cooperated. Borders existed, but business flowed freely across them. From supply chains to banking, everything was built on the idea that we were all, more or less, playing the same game. But in 2025, that illusion is falling apart, and in its place comes a new reality. A world not of shared goals, but of rival systems. It's already happening. Around the world, countries are building their own economic fortresses, forming new trade blocs, alternative payment systems, and exclusive alliances based not on efficiency but on politics, security, and survival. The dream of a single global market is fading, and what's emerging is something older, more familiar, and more dangerous. Spheres of influence. Let's start with the United States. After decades of pushing global integration, America is now trying to recenter the world around itself. Trump's tariffs in 2025, especially the 125% duties on Chinese imports, weren't just economic tools. They were a message. If you want access to the US market, you follow our rules. And many nations are listening, not out of loyalty but out of necessity. The US still commands the world's largest consumer market, its most powerful currency, and its deepest capital markets. And so, countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico are rapidly deepening ties with Washington, hoping to benefit from China's exclusion. But this is not partnership, it's alignment under pressure. Meanwhile, in the East, China is responding. Beijing knows it's being pushed out of the Western-centric order, and it's building a new one in response. At the heart of it is the Belt and Road Initiative, a sprawling infrastructure and finance network linking China with Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. Add to that the BRICS Plus alliance, which now includes Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa, Iran, and several other emerging powers, all working toward alternatives to the US-led financial system. They're exploring a shared payment system that bypasses the US dollar joint investment banks, cross-border digital currencies, long-term energy and resource pacts. And while some of these plans are still fragile, the momentum is real, because many countries, tired of Western dominance, are now choosing China, not out of trust, but out of strategic defiance. In Europe, things are different. Caught between the two giants, the European Union is trying to go its own way, building what it calls strategic autonomy. It means localizing energy production, reducing dependency on US tech firms, setting its own rules for digital trade and environmental policy, strengthening military independence through NATO plus structures. But Europe faces its own tensions. Some countries still lean toward Washington. Others flirt with China for trade deals, and still others are turning inward. Nationalist, fragmented, fearful of migration and economic shocks. The EU wants unity, but its future may lie in navigating between the storms, not controlling them. Elsewhere, new groupings are rising. In Africa, nations are negotiating their own continental trade zone, the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, hoping to finally trade more with each other than with former colonial powers. In Latin America, countries like Brazil and Argentina are coordinating alternative currency ideas to reduce their reliance on US dollars. Even the Gulf states are experimenting with regional finance mechanisms tied to oil, gas, and emerging tech, investing heavily in Africa and Asia while trying to hedge their dependence on the West. The common thread? Every region is searching for independence. Every economy is asking, who can we trust? Who will we trade with when the old systems fail? What happens if we go our own way? What we're witnessing is not a full collapse. It's a reordering. A shift from one globalized system to many competing ones. And the results are both promising and dangerous. On one hand, new alliances could empower the Global South, reduce dependency, and create more balanced development. But on the other hand, economic fragmentation comes with real risks: duplication of systems, conflicting standards, financial instability, and worst of all, the return of zero-sum thinking, where one country's gain is seen as another's loss. In this new world, trade is no longer neutral. It's a weapon, a threat, a tool of diplomacy, coercion, and influence. And it's being used everywhere. So what happens now? Where does this lead? Globalization was never just about trade. It was about people, about the way we work, what we buy, what we eat, how we travel, and even what we dream of. It shaped cities, careers, cultures. It connected lives across oceans, stitched together economies, and promised a future where the entire planet moved forward, together. But now, that future is falling apart, and what we're left with is a new reality, where the consequences of globalization's collapse are no longer global theories. They're personal stories. In homes across the world, the signs are subtle, but undeniable. Food is more expensive. Flights are less predictable. A product that once arrived in 2 days now takes 2 weeks, or maybe it doesn't arrive at all. There are fewer options on shelves, fewer foreign students in classrooms, fewer migrant workers in fields and factories. And behind every shortage, every delay, every new cost is a story of a system breaking down. It starts with prices. Globalization once brought consumers cheap goods, made in low-wage regions, shipped at scale, and sold for less. It was the secret behind the $5 t-shirt, the $300 smartphone, the discount bin full of Made in China labels. But in 2025, that era is ending. As supply chains fracture, tariffs rise, and friendshoring replaces free trade, prices are creeping upward, not in a dramatic inflation spike, but in a slow, grinding squeeze. Every month, every year, life costs a little more. And for millions of families, that little more is already too much. Then comes the impact on work. In the global age, jobs were reshaped by trade. Some disappeared, but others were born. Outsourced call centers in India, tech hubs in Eastern Europe, manufacturing jobs in Mexico and Vietnam, logistics, e-commerce, and digital consulting roles worldwide. Globalization didn't eliminate jobs. It moved them and rewrote what they looked like. But in a deglobalizing world, those patterns are collapsing. Reshoring means factories returning home, but often with fewer workers and more automation. Remote work means companies can still hire globally, but now they can fire globally too. Migrant labor shortages are affecting agriculture, construction, and caregiving in rich nations, while unemployment grows in poor ones. And entire industries, like tourism, international education, and logistics, are facing a slow, uncertain decline. For workers, the question is no longer, where's my job going? It's, will my job exist at all? And beyond the economy, there's something even deeper, a shift in mobility, opportunity, connection. Borders are tightening. Visas are harder to get. Cultural exchanges are slowing. International students are dropping in number. Digital platforms are being split by country, regulation, and ideology. The dream of a connected world, of living in one place, working in another, and retiring somewhere else, is starting to look like a relic of the past. But the pain isn't evenly shared. Wealthy nations are building buffers, stockpiles, subsidies, and incentives to soften the blow. Poorer countries aren't so lucky. When global trade slows, developing economies lose access to markets, capital, and critical imports. When food prices rise, it's the most vulnerable who go hungry first. And when supply chains break, it's the weakest links that snap. Small exporters, farmers, factory workers, local businesses. In many parts of the world, deglobalization isn't just inconvenient. It's catastrophic. And with economic pressure comes political unrest. When people can't afford food or fuel, governments fall. When jobs disappear, extremism grows. When trade dries up, conflict brews. We've already seen it. Protests in Sri Lanka, unrest in Peru, energy riots in Europe, far-right movements rising across the West, and authoritarian powers tightening their grip under the banner of nationalism and economic independence. The fall of globalization isn't just economic. It's deeply political. But even in the middle of this breakdown, something else is happening. People are adapting. Locals are rebuilding what global markets abandoned. Small farms are rising where imports once dominated. Neighborhoods are turning to cooperatives. Cities are experimenting with circular economies. Regional trade is growing. New identities are forming, based not on globalism, but on community. In the absence of one world, many smaller ones are taking root, more fragile, more limited, but perhaps more grounded. The New World Disorder. What comes after globalization? The system is breaking, not with a crash, but with a slow, grinding unraveling. For decades, globalization was the dominant force shaping our world. Now, in 2025, its foundation is cracked, and what rises in its place is still uncertain. The question is no longer if globalization is falling. The question is, what will take its place? Some believe this is a temporary phase, that the shocks of pandemics, wars, and tariffs will pass, that global trade will rebound, that technology and profit will eventually force the world back into connection. They argue that supply chains can be redesigned, that trust can be rebuilt, that no country, no matter how powerful, can afford to go it alone forever. They believe this is just the next chapter in a longer story. But others see something different. They see the beginning of a new world disorder, a permanent shift away from global unity and toward strategic fragmentation. They see rival blocs forming, a divided internet, competing currencies, conflicting standards, and regionalized power centers fighting to control resources, influence, and trade. This isn't the Cold War. This is something more complex, a world not of two sides, but of many competing systems. In this emerging world, power is shifting fast. The United States remains dominant, for now, but increasingly focused inward. Its alliances are conditional. Its trade policies are defensive. Its leadership in global institutions is no longer guaranteed. China, emboldened by its industrial strength and growing partnerships, is building a parallel network, one that doesn't rely on Western approval or US dollars. Europe is caught in between, wealthy, cautious, and fragmented. India is rising, younger, louder, and more ambitious. And the global South, for the first time in history, is demanding a seat at the table. In this landscape, every country is forced to choose. Who do you trade with? Whose standards do you follow? Whose currency do you hold? Whose rules do you obey? There is no longer one system. There are many, and navigating them is the new game of global survival. But while governments strategize and businesses adapt, ordinary people are left in the middle, caught between inflation and instability, disconnected from global opportunity, forced to live with the consequences of decisions made far above their reach. They are not citizens of a global village. They are residents of islands, separated by tariffs, fear, and broken systems. Yet even in this fractured world, there is opportunity. Local industries are rising. New technologies are enabling decentralized trade. Digital currencies are challenging the monopoly of central banks. People are rebuilding communities, not globally but locally. Resilience is replacing efficiency, and culture is reasserting itself in new, authentic forms. From chaos, new systems are taking root. They are smaller, slower, more uncertain, but they may be more human. Still, the danger remains. History has shown us that when global cooperation collapses, competition turns to rivalry. Rivalry turns to conflict. And conflict, in a fractured world armed with nuclear weapons and digital warfare, is more dangerous than ever. The challenge of the 21st century is not whether we can connect again. It's whether we can coexist in a world where connection is no longer guaranteed. The fall of globalization is not the end of the world, but it is the end of an era of integration, of speed, of scale, of blind faith in the market. What comes next? A multipolar system, a digital borderland, or a new kind of globalism is still unwritten. And it will be shaped by the choices we make now. Will we retreat into walls, or build bridges that are smarter and stronger? Will we fight for dominance, or design systems that allow for difference? Will we let fear divide us, or allow imagination to rebuild something better? The old world is gone. A new one is rising, and its shape depends on us.